Today, we're going to talk about one of the most revolutionary and honestly most overlooked stories in American history. It's about how 4 million newly freed people, against impossible odds, became the real driving force behind creating public education in the American South. This story completely flips the script on who we think of as the founders of our school systems, and it all starts with understanding the world they were up against.
To really get how radical this movement was, you have to get the world it was born into. And this quote, from a Louisiana legislator who was just shocked at the sight of a school for black children, well, it says it all. The idea wasn't just unpopular. To the white power structure, it was absurd, it was dangerous, and it was a total disruption of their social order.
You see, before the Civil War, the South was basically an educational desert. For almost everyone, black and white, formal schooling just wasn't a thing. It was a privilege, and it was reserved for the wealthy elite.
So why? Well, you had two huge roadblocks. First, you've got the wealthy planters. They believed that educating the laboring class was, frankly, a bad investment. It made people harder to exploit, so they absolutely refused to be taxed for it. Then you had the poor white laborers. For the most part, they just accepted their lot in life and didn't really demand schools, because many of them hoped that one day they could become slaveholders themselves.
Now, for the 4 million enslaved black people, the situation was so much worse. It wasn't just that they didn't have access to education, it was illegal. Every single slave state had what were called literacy laws that made teaching an enslaved person to read or write a serious crime. Why? Because knowledge was seen as a direct threat to the entire system of slavery.
And the result of that system is right here in this one staggering number. At the moment of emancipation, it's estimated that a full 95% of the newly freed population could not read or write. That was the void, the immense challenge they were facing on day one of freedom.
But what happened next was incredible. Out of this educational desert, a mass movement just bloomed. It was this powerful grassroots explosion of demand for learning that swept across the entire freed community.
And nobody said it better than Booker T. This wasn't some small effort. We're talking about men and women in their 70s, sitting in night schools right next to little kids. Everyone was driven by this intense desire to learn, many just hoping they could learn to read the Bible before they died. Day schools, night schools, Sunday schools, they were always packed.
And this, right here, is the absolute core of our story. The idea of universal public education paid for by the public was not some idea that came down from Northern reformers. It was, as the source material puts it, fundamentally a Negro idea. It was the freed people themselves who saw the direct link between knowledge and power and who believed that education was the key to true freedom. And look, this wasn't just some wishful thinking. They put their money where their mouths were. In just 4 years, a community that started with literally nothing contributed over $750,000, which was an insane amount of money back then, to build and support their own schools. The level of sacrifice and commitment is just incredible.
So how did this massive grassroots demand turn into an actual working system? Well, it was a multi-stage process that actually laid the foundation for the public education we know in the South today. This journey really happened in 3 key steps. First, it started with that grassroots demand we just talked about, freed people pooling what little they had to build schools and hire teachers. Then, this incredible effort got the attention of Northern aid societies and, really importantly, the Federal Freedmen's Bureau. They came in with funding, infrastructure, and coordination. And finally, all of this momentum led to the new Reconstruction state governments, where black legislators were instrumental in writing universal education into state law for the very first time. You can see that explosive growth right here. In 1866, schools working with the Freedmen's Bureau had about 90,000 students. Just 4 years later, that number had almost tripled to nearly 250,000. This was a revolution happening in real time.
But as you can imagine, this revolution was met with a furious and violent counter-revolution. The white Southern establishment didn't see black education as progress. They saw it as a fundamental threat to their entire way of life.
This quote, it's blunt, it's ugly, but it perfectly sums up the racist thinking of the time. The belief was that education would make black people insolent and unwilling to do manual labor, basically ruining them for the role they were supposed to have in Southern society. And this wasn't just talk, it fueled a real campaign of terror. Teachers, especially the ones who came from the North, were shunned and violently attacked. Schoolhouses and churches, the very heart of the black community, were burned to the ground. And if violence didn't work, officials would just find ways to steal or misuse the money meant for these new schools.
The threat wasn't abstract at all. It was immediate, and it was deadly. The records from back then are filled with these awful, visceral threats, just like this one. In a lot of places in the South, a teacher couldn't even think about opening a school without federal troops there to protect them.
And yet, and this is the amazing part, despite all the violence, despite the relentless opposition, the movement worked. It created a legacy. It embedded the idea of public education so deeply into the laws and fabric of the South that it could never be completely torn out.
Now check this out, because this is where you can see the radical legal shift. Just look at South Carolina. A failed attempt at free schools way back in 1811 is totally replaced in 1868 with a constitutional mandate for universal education. In Georgia and Mississippi, these vague, badly run poor school funds were transformed into systems for all children. And this happened because newly enfranchised black voters and their representatives now had political power.
So, what was the secret sauce? What was the mechanism that actually made it all possible? It sounds kind of boring, but it's this: direct taxation to pay for schools. Before the war, planters would never have agreed to it, but the Reconstruction governments made it law, and for the first time created a sustainable public funding model. This was the engine that would power public education for both black and white children for generations.
But to keep this movement going, they needed a new generation of black teachers and leaders. This led to the founding of these incredible institutions, many with help from the North and the Freedmen's Bureau. Schools like Howard, Hampton, and Fisk became the places where the educators who would carry this torch forward were trained.
And you really can't overstate how important this was. As the source material puts it so powerfully, without these schools and colleges, without the leadership and knowledge they created, the white supremacist counter-revolution might have succeeded. It might have driven black people, for all intents and purposes, right back into slavery. Education was the firewall.
So that leaves us with one big, crucial question. This history shows us that the foundation for universal publicly funded education in the South was laid by its most marginalized people. But if that foundation was put in place over 150 years ago, it makes you ask, what happened to the building? And what does it mean that we're still fighting for equitable schools today?